Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jim Ludis. I'm the Executive Director of the Pell Center here at Salve, Regina University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this forum tonight. We're here because after 2 years of civil war and more than 100,000 dead, chemical weapons were used in Syria on August 21st. The fact that they were used is not really in any dispute. The President of the United States has now asked Congress for an authorization to use military force to respond to that use of chemical weapons. The conversation that we want to have tonight is about that request to use force, about the issues facing the United States in the region, and about the humanitarian consequences that will certainly follow whether or not the United States does something or doesn't do anything. We have a great couple of speakers that are here tonight to help us with this conversation. From left to right, from the chair of the Department of Political Science here at Salve Regina University, Dr. Clark Merrill. Clark, thank you for being here. Thank you for all of your support of the Pell Center. The center here is Dr. Timothy Hoyt, who is a professor of strategy at the Naval War College across town here. Tim and I are also former office mates. We shared a row house in Georgetown 15 years ago. Tim is, I think, honestly one of the most thoughtful and insightful strategists working today. He published an article in the National Interest a week ago about the options that force planners can think about in thinking about a strike against Syria. That inspired me to call Tim and say, school's back in session. We'd like to do a forum on this. Tim, can you come over? He's been very gracious with his time today and tonight. He's headed to the Middle East tomorrow, so Tim, thank you very much for being with us. I should note, in case he doesn't, that Tim is an employee of the Department of Defense, but his views are his own, and they do not represent the views of the Department of Defense or the United States government. Does that cover it?
Yep, thanks.
Good. Good. So to get us started, though, and so we're going to do a little bit different format than we normally do at Pell Center events. Both gentlemen are going to have an opportunity to give a few remarks. Then I'm going to play Phil Donahue, which is a reference that I hope isn't lost on too many people. But I will ask a few questions. We'll get the conversation started, and then I'm going to run around the audience with my microphone, and we'll hopefully get some good give and take tonight. So without further ado, Dr. Merrill, please get us started.
Good evening. I'm going to begin not by talking about the current issue, the debate about what the United States should do. Rather, I'm going to go back and give a very quick, very simplified historical sketch so that we all have some background for the decision that we're confronting as a country today. This will be familiar territory to some of you. But for all of us, I think it's good just to refresh our memory of what the situation in Syria is. First of all, Syria is a society, like a lot around the world, that its politics is characterized by factional divisions. And in Syria, the factions are defined by sectarianism. Now, that was not a problem. It was a potential problem, but not an actual problem until after World War I. Before World War I, Syria was divided up among Ottoman territory. The Ottoman Empire was a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic Islamic empire. And the different divisions, sectarian divisions within the Ottoman territory of what would later become Syria were not political problems, okay? Now, after World War I, between the two world wars, Syria became a mandate of France under the League of Nations. And in the 1920s, especially in the 20s and going on into the 30s, the French made an attempt to sort of stop some of these potential sectarian controversies from flaring up. During the 20s, the French experimented with the creation of dividing Syria up into a number of small sectarian states. I actually discovered this for the first time in the research I did for the talk today. I hadn't even realized that in the 1920s, within the French mandate, there was an attempt to create an independent Alawite state, the Christian state of Lebanon, which was the one that did survive as an independent state, a separate Druze state, and then the Sunnis, who were the majority population within the entire territory. The French attempted to create two Sunni states. I assume it was two rather than one large Sunni state, because one large Sunni state would simply, obviously, overpower the other smaller ones. By 1930, that experiment was defunct. All of the different territories, except for Lebanon, were rolled up into a single kingdom of Syria. Now, after World War II, the French obviously left, and Syria was open to the question, which group is going to come out on top? There was a series of conflicts I won't go into. By the 1960s, the Ba'athist Party came to dominance, and by 1970, Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar, seized power, ruled Syria from 1970 until his death in 2000. The Assad regime was the Assad family is Alawite, one of the minority sects within Syria, and the Assad regime was absolutely merciless in maintaining its grasp on power. In 1982, there was a kind of a rehearsal for what we're seeing now. In 1982, the Muslim Brotherhood, who were Sunni, they represented the majority, 75% majority faction in Syria, attempted a revolt against the Assad Alawite-dominated regime. Hafez al-Assad put that revolt down absolutely brutally. In the single city of Hama, which was the center of the Muslim Brotherhood revolt, much of the city of Hama was leveled, and we don't know what the casualties were. People estimate that anywhere between a low estimate of 20,000 and a high estimate of 40,000 people were simply slaughtered by the Assad regime to keep its power. Now, with the Arab Spring, which started several years ago, 2010, December, it spread to Syria. In March of 2011, there was the first street protest in Syria. It was followed by a number of other protests growing in size. And interestingly, the Assad regime met the very first street protest, inspired by the success of the Arab Spring in other countries like Tunisia and Egypt. The Assad regime met that first street protest by firing on the protesters, and there were some killed from that very first protest. It's grown out of control ever since. So that's my thumbnail sketch of the history. The sectarian divisions, just to give you a little bit of a sense of the size, the proportions, the identity of the different groups that are in play here. The Alawites represent about 10% of the Syrian population. They're concentrated in the hill country along the Mediterranean coast, largely between Lebanon and Turkey. So that would be the northwest of the country. I'm not sure it's necessary to go into the background. The Alawites are an well, I will go into this much. The Alawites are an offshoot of Shia Islam. They split from the dominant Twelver Shia Islam, which is the kind of Shiism that you have in Iran. They split from the Twelvers in the 10th century. They're a syncretist religion. They blend elements of Islam together with Gnosticism, Christianity, folk religion. A lot of the Sunnis do not consider the Alawites to be truly Muslim. The Druze, you may have heard about, they're a much smaller group, about 3% of the population, concentrated in the south and along the border with Lebanon. They also are a Shia offshoot from the 11th century, very secretive. We don't know much about them. The Druze also would be threatened by a Sunni-dominated Syria because, like the Alawites, the Sunnis don't consider, many Sunnis, probably most Sunnis, they consider the Druze to be heretics. Christians are about 10% of the population, 10%, and I suspect falling. The Sunni, about 75% of the population. And let that be enough background.
Thank you, Clark. Tim.
Okay, well, first off, again, I have to reiterate what you're going to hear are my opinions and not the opinions of the U.S. government, which you'll probably find out in just a moment. The first thing is, sadly, where we're at right now is probably a very good case study in how not to do foreign policy. And I'm not saying that as a partisan statement. I'm saying that as a way of approaching the process, which I think has been very erratic, and it's why I actually wrote an op-ed, which is something I don't often do. The problem is we are debating military action. And we're having a very serious debate about military action. It's happening already, has been approved in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It will go onto the floor of Congress next week. It will be the authorization to use military force. It is not clear to me that we have decided what our objective is for the use of military force. And if you don't know what you intend to accomplish by using military force, the likelihood that you will not accomplish it drops precipitously. Here's the problem. There are at least 4 different objectives that I've heard articulated for what the West and the international community wants out of Syria. There are many more than 4, but 4 seems a good way to simplify it. The first is just to contain the conflict. That has been a large part of the international community's response to Syria for the last 30 months, while 100,000 people were killed and while 2 million people were displaced from Syria to neighboring countries. A second thing, the one that you hear most clearly, I think, right now, is to deter the future use of chemical weapons. Because chemical weapons have been used, they have been used in large and detectable amounts on August 21st. Over 1,000 people reportedly have been killed, and there may be more as we continue on, because unfortunately the effects of chemical weapons sometimes linger. A third is to adjust the balance in the Syrian civil war. For the last 6 months, government forces have been doing relatively better, although it's not clear that they're actually winning. They have been doing much better in the last 6 months than in the previous 24. And last but not least, something that many people have said, is to overthrow the Assad regime. Those are objectives that in some ways are diametrically opposed. You cannot contain the conflict if you overthrow the Assad regime. That's just not going to happen. And how you use military force may have a great deal of impact on whether the Assad regime decides to use more chemical weapons. The greater threat that Assad is in, the greater the likelihood that he will resort to the most powerful and effective weapon in his arsenal, which unfortunately is sarin gas, which was used on August 21st. As a result, we're going at this in a kind of a backward way. But as we think about using military force, I'd bring up 4 other things that we need to think about. The first is, it is very much in both America's and the international community's interest that the fighting does not escalate. And it could escalate horizontally by spreading geographically across the Middle East. It could involve Israel, it could involve Iraq, it could involve Iran. It could also escalate vertically, greater use of chemical weapons, or perhaps even sparking a conflict between Israel and Iran as the conflict spills over and becomes something greater. So escalation is a major worry. The second major worry is entanglement. The greater our objective, the greater the likelihood that the U.S. will be asked to do more. And right now, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, again, has tried to draw clear lines about the limits of the involvement. They do not want American ground troops in Syria. They want it limited to air power. They would like coalition partners as much as possible. The greater the objective, especially if the objective becomes to overthrow the Assad regime, the greater the likelihood that those lines are not going to be enough. To overthrow the Assad regime may take a significant military intervention by someone. 2 other things to think about are the objectives of military strikes by the United States to punish someone for doing something wrong. If so, one might be able to use the military in fairly precise ways to try and convey a particular political message. For instance, it may be difficult to punish Assad himself for the use of chemical weapons. As we found in trying to find Saddam Hussein, leaders have a way of being mobile. It's hard to find them. It's hard to affect them. It might be, however, possible to punish the people who fired the chemical weapons themselves. There are military units that are associated with this. If the objective is punishment and to make a statement, that might be one way in which military force could be used in a fairly limited way with a modest risk of escalation. Last but not least, is the objective to prevent something? Is it to prevent future chemical weapons use? That's going to be very, very hard indeed. Syrian chemical weapons stockpiles are enormous. They're very large. They've been around for 25 years at least. And frankly, we probably don't know where they all are. So if the objective is to deter the future use of chemical weapons, how we use force may have a great deal to do with whether we actually make use of chemical weapons more likely. The more you increase the threat to the regime itself, the higher the likelihood of use. The more targets that you hit, the higher the likelihood either of use or that the weapons get dispersed to other units, which may increase the probability of use in the future. These are pretty complex questions. I don't think that they are all going to be resolved on the floors of Congress. And unfortunately, again, they're questions where we as a public may not have a lot of time to have a voice. So it's good that we have an opportunity to sit and talk about them today before bigger votes come next week. And with that, in the interest of spurring questions and more conversation, I'll stop.
Great. So we're gonna open it up to questions here. While you're thinking, I'm gonna ask a quick one, and then I'd put it to both of you. The casualty estimates of the war in the last 2 years are north of 100,000.
100,000 fatalities.
100,000 fatalities, correct. I'm sorry. And the Secretary Kerry got a little heat for being so precise with his estimate of the number of people killed in this chemical weapons attack, which was 1,429, to quote the Secretary. Why does the United States care how a regime kills its people? If it's through artillery or bullets versus chemical weapons, why is this the red line?
Should I? Okay. Well, I think, first off, the United States has had a policy for a long time. We haven't always followed it or enforced it, but we have had a policy under both Republican and Democratic administrations that we object to both the use and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. That was the justification for 2 wars with Iraq. It was the justification for strikes on the Sudan and Afghanistan in 1998 during the sort of abortive bin Laden raid. It was a concern with Serbia. So there is a consistent policy in the United States, if not consistent follow-through, over the use of these weapons. The second is there is a concern that there are international norms that have been developed against the use of these weapons since the Geneva Protocols in 1925, and that allowing people to break those norms, to violate them, may increase the risk not only of chemical weapons use, but also of other weapons of mass destruction by states around the world. There's a concern that North Korea, which has both chemical and nuclear weapons, might get bad ideas if they see that Syria can get away with it. There's a concern that Iran, which has chemical weapons and is working on nuclear weapons, may again feel more empowered if Syria gets away with this. There's a lot of debate about that, but it is, I would say, a consistent theme of American foreign policy under both Democratic and Republican presidents. So there's some constant thread since dating back to the 1980s.
The United States Americans have very little appetite for humanitarian interventions. We talk about them, but then if we try them, like in Somalia, Americans are not willing to pay the cost of humanitarian interventions. That's why the ratcheting up to the use of chemical weapons in Syria actually did cross, I won't say a red line, but it crossed a line in America's interest in that conflict. there have been international agreements going back to a protocol to the Geneva Conventions in the 1920s forbidding the use of chemical weapons. So that does, I think, move it to a higher level of concern for the United States. Certainly, we don't want the example to be set that a country can use chemical weapons because what does that say to the North Koreans? What does that say to the Iranians?
Okay, folks, it's your turn. Questions? Over to you, sir. Hey, if you could just make sure it's a question. Okay.
Hi, Tim. How you doing? Jim Buxton.
Ah, nice to see
Good
you.
to see you again. Wondering if you could speak about the Christian Syrians. Am I right in my understanding that historically they've supported the al-Assad family, being that they're both minorities? Is there a single Christian voice in Syria, a leader who is saying what they think should happen? And why we perhaps don't hear much about it in the media, in the news reporting as to the situation of the Syrian Christians and their surprising support historically for al-Assad?
That's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer for you. I believe that one of the reasons that Christians have supported the Assad family is specifically because they are in the position of minorities. And therefore, a minority regime will provide them, they feel, more protection than a majority. If the Assad family were to fall, a majority Sunni regime might be more threatening. As we have seen other places in the Middle East, some new Sunni regimes have taken a harder line against local Christian communities and have been more oppressive. I have to admit that is more of a guess than informed analysis, but I think that there's something there. I don't know who the Christian leaders are in Syria. I'm sorry, I wish I could help you more with that.
I've got a question over here from a student. We're going to go to him next. All right, well, you look like a student, so you fooled me.
How's it going? Thanks a lot for talking. So my question is about the possibilities of a political settlement in Syria. So I think you've heard from numerous sources that like the way out of the Syrian war, I mean, potentially, let's say we invade, we take down Assad, Iraq-ish, in that we're then creating a new government. But there's also the idea of a settlement being formed. I mean, the challenges involved are that the rebel groups don't want Assad there, and the other groups, and Assad wants to be there. But how would you see sort of a strike, and it varies based on its objective, affecting the possibility for achieving that settlement, or the strategies the U.S. could engage in to sort of support doing so?
A political settlement as opposed to a militarily imposed settlement would certainly be preferable. Why would the Assad regime, though, enter into political negotiations with the insurgents? I should think that Assad would only do that if he thought he was likely to lose. So at the present time, I'd say the likelihood of beginning a political process between the two sides is nil. Now, if something changed, perhaps the contribution of American power or some other power that changed Assad's calculation about his own self-interest, then and only then, I think he might be open.
I'd add to that if I could, because it's a great question. Unfortunately, war is a two-sided dynamic. Both sides get a vote. And the part of the problem would be the perception of both sides. At the current time, it appears that Assad feels reasonably positive about the efforts of the Syrian government forces over the last 6 months. If, however, a strike were to significantly degrade the Syrian forces and assist the rebels might then feel very positive about their own chances and not be inclined to negotiate. This is one of the reasons that civil wars take two patterns. One is that outside forces intervene and one side or the other wins fairly quickly. The other is that outside forces don't intervene or don't intervene much, and the war drags on in a bloody stalemate for a long period of time. Perversely, those wars are the ones that are most likely to create a negotiated settlement over time. That comes at very high cost to societies, but those are the ones that might have a greater chance of a stable and lasting political settlement at the end, because both sides compromise out of a sense of exhaustion and relative weakness. Therefore, one of my concerns about America intervening militarily is if we tilt the balance too much one way or the other, that might eliminate the chance, or at least postpone the chance for a negotiated settlement.
Sobering thought. We have a question right here.
Yes, this is directed to Dr. Hoyt, but I would appreciate a comment from Dr. Merrill as well. I listened to most of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearings, and the primary goal expressed by our Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, was to maintain our credibility. We'd drawn the line, we have to do something. And the objectives you stated, as I understood them, were kind of corollaries. We must do it in a way that, quote, contains the conflict. We must do it in a way that doesn't threaten the regime, because we're not sure that what would follow would be any better, and so forth. We must deter the future use by acting. But the key thing, we must maintain our credibility. You didn't mention that, I'm sure not because you forgot about it, but by some other reason. Why didn't you include that?
I think the credibility debate comes as part and parcel with the issue of chemical weapons use. I mean, I think that they're very closely linked. The idea is that having drawn that line and given our long-standing policy in that arena, that when someone uses massed chemical weapons, therefore our credibility is at risk. Credibility is an important issue. It's one that Thucydides wrote about 2,500 years ago in the Peloponnesian War, where he said that the reason that states go to war are because of fear, honor, and interest. Honor is credibility. A state's reputation matters. On the other hand, it can't be measured. And one could make a really good case that we would be less credible if we made a rash, sudden military strike that was ineffective than we would if we did nothing. So I find it a very hard thing to talk about. I would not say it's an unimportant issue. I just always immediately begin asking policymakers and my students, well, what exactly do you mean, and what do you have in mind, and how is what you intend to do going to enhance or affect our credibility? I think what you hear on the floor of Congress, legitimately, is trying to set up the parameters that would explain why we would use military force, because that is what the debate is about. They're not really talking about how to use it and what the connection would be between our use of force and our credibility. And that is where I think, again, we as citizens, but also I think the security elites in the United States could put more thought and more care. Because I heard a lot of options for 2 weeks in Washington that were coming out in op-ed columns. Most of them, it seemed to me, did very little to enhance our credibility and did very little to ensure that we could somehow keep a lid on the conflict and keep it from escalating. It seemed to me that all of the options that were being discussed would push us in very different directions and therefore be counterproductive to those goals.
If I can chime in, I agree. Credibility is extremely important in international relations, especially the impression that a country and its leaders are willing to use their power if they need to. That credibility is key. And we seem to be in a position where we will lose credibility as a nation if we do not act. However, I agree with Dr. Hoyt. A series of pinprick Tomahawk missile strikes may cause us to lose credibility as damagingly or even worse. I think the United States may be in a position where we do, a la Senator McCain, need to do more than Tomahawk missile strikes. If we are left with only the first two options, do nothing or do pinprick strikes, I don't know which is worse, but in that event, we would have gotten ourselves into a situation where both options are bad.
I'm just impressed with the citation to Thucydides. That's a bonus point. We've got a question down here on the end.
Hello, my name is Tarek, and I'm Syrian American. I lived in Syria for like 20 years of my life. And my main question is, if the President Barack Obama, if he said the red line is going to be using the chemical weapons, and he said that like more than a year ago. So that means that you know this thing's gonna happen in the future. So why you didn't try to prevent this from happening in the past and save those innocent lives? And just like small corrections, the people who died, there are more than 1,800 people. Yeah, that's my question.
Thank you. Well, I think part of the argument for making the red line, for which President Obama is now being criticized, but sometimes making a strong statement will help deter someone from doing something bad. It implies that if you do what has been condemned, that there will be prompt action. One might make an argument, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it might be a legitimate way of thinking about it, that perhaps President Obama's statement put off the significant use of chemical weapons by a year. Because if the president hadn't said anything, the Assad regime might have resorted to chemical weapons a year ago when the military situation was much worse. It's unclear now why they did resort to the mass use of chemical weapons. We do know from what the president has said that there's a strong belief that they have used chemical weapons at least 10 times in the past year. So that would suggest that the issue was a threshold issue, something that could be identified, that could be clearly demonstrated to be a transgression, because use of small amounts may be very hard to verify. Why didn't the president do more a year ago? Again, preventing someone with huge stockpiles of chemical weapons from using them is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. It cannot be done by military force unless you actually go in and seize all the chemical weapons. And that is an enormous task that the United States has not been prepared to do. Therefore, you have to use diplomacy, you use coercion, you use threats, you cajole, you try and contact their allies to put pressure on them. You try a whole range of other instruments of statecraft in an effort to convince the Assad regime that this would be a bad idea. And for some reason, we still don't know what happened, but for some reason last month, those efforts failed. And now it has become, again, this issue of credibility. Now the president feels an obligation to do something, and as he has been saying to European leaders all day today, this isn't just a matter of American credibility. It's not just an American red line. It's an international red line. It's a matter of international credibility, and he's seeking support for that. But clearly, the effort to deter through words failed, ultimately. And now the question is what to do next.
Folks, there are a lot of you who have questions, which is great, and we're going to try to get to all of you, so don't be afraid to keep putting that hand up. I will come to you, I promise, but right now we're going to this lady right here.
Good evening, and thank you. I can't help but be curious about the lack of United Nations input into all this discussion. It seems to be the United States that's standing by itself without even the European backing. And what kind of risk do we run if we take it upon ourselves to go in without the UN blessing?
That's a great question. And frankly, there are two elements to it. The first is we did try to begin collecting international backing last week, and it backfired because Britain had a vote in Parliament, and the British government lost. Parliament voted not to use military force. Now, that vote may come back up again, but that created enormous pressure. In the United Nations, there are two key problems, and no offense, but they're Russia and China. The UN Security Council is 5 members: Russia, China, Britain, France, the United States. Each has a veto. Russia has very strong interests in Syria, and the likelihood that it would veto any attempt to get UN authority for military action against Syria is really quite high. And they suffer no costs for vetoing, because who's going to mess with Russia? China is more interesting. China is very worried about international intervention inside sovereign states for humanitarian reasons. China consistently resists this as a matter of policy. It did not resist it in the case of Libya. And I think Chinese leadership have decided that was a really bad idea. That as a result, the international community intervened much more significantly in Libya than China anticipated and had a much greater result. China doesn't like the idea of international community intervening in states because it does not want the international community intervening in China over human rights issues. China doesn't veto many resolutions. It has vetoed resolutions on Syria. This is clearly an important national interest for them, and one that it's unlikely we can get their vote for. So as a result, the UN option is really hamstrung by the rules of the UN itself.
I can contribute one thing to that comment. Your very good question. Some people are under the impression that international law has developed to the point where any military action by a country requires UN Security Council approval, resolution. That simply is erroneous. The United States would not be in contravention of international law if we took military action in Syria. The idea that it is against international law is simply erroneous. Russia, as you said, absolutely will block us in the Security Council. Therefore, the Security Council is a non-starter. Another tie-in with Russia, though, that I'll bring in at this point, if we do take military action in Syria, if we hit targets with missiles or bombs or whatever we employ, it's very unlikely that we can shift the momentum of events inside Syria if the Russians are willing to give the Syrians, to make up for the Syrians, whatever we destroy. If we blow something up, the Russians will replace it at this point. How do we get around that? If we do want to change the momentum of events, if we do want to move toward threatening of the Assad regime, we've got to get Russia's cooperation. And I think the only way we can do that is by negotiating with Russia and making concessions, giving the Russians something they want. Billions of dollars, concessions in some international issue, so that the Russians won't simply replace whatever we
We have a question in the back here.
Two brief questions. One to you, Professor Merrill. On what basis of international law would an invasion or an attack, in this case, go forward specifically? Because the head of the UN has said it is a violation or would be a violation of law. The second question is about the very premise of this conversation. The Institute for Public Integrity documented 945 times in which lies were told by the administration in the lead up to the Iraq War. Why should we believe what the government is telling us now when when it's not an ironclad case and when there are still doubts being raised by major leaders overseas and by significant journalists?
I think I heard two questions. One about international law and one about evidence. The international law question, which I'll ask you to fill in what I fail to. The international law question, the United States has always retained the prerogative to use military force if it is determined that it is in our national interest to do so. We have not conceded or transferred that power to an international body.
National
Also
interest or self-defense? Isn't it usually in response to
Not
immediate
necessarily.
threat to security?
I don't think
so.
we've been in
Oil interests would justify an attack.
That would be at the discretion of our political leadership. We are a sovereign nation. As far as the evidence goes, there has been, I think, sufficient evidence. I don't think evidence is in question. There have been intelligence intercepts of conversations between the Syrian Ministry of Defense and local chemical the officers for local chemical weapons units in Syria. Satellite data has shown that the artillery and the missiles carrying the chemical weapons originated from regime-dominated areas, and they targeted insurgent-dominated areas. Just recently, there was a report that I heard, and take this with a grain of salt. German intelligence reports that they intercepted a call between someone in Hezbollah communicating with someone in Iran, saying that Assad himself approved, again, take this with a grain of salt, but that Assad himself approved the use of chemical weapons and is now panicking that he's opened a can of worms.
We heard the same kind of things in the run-up to the
But the,
kind of ironclad evidence, intercepts, the same stuff turned out to be a load of bomb.
but the fundamental difference here, this, if you're going to compare this to Iraq, the comparison is with Saddam Hussein's attack on the Kurds at Halabja. There is incontrovertible evidence that poison gas has been used. This is not a question of whether poison gas exists or not. There is no doubt that poison gas has been used on an innocent population. That's a very good question. And for me, Occam's razor says the size of the attack could not be carried out by insurgents with homemade mortars and rockets, and no training in chemical weapons. This was a chemical strike that was carried out by trained units. We have overhead intelligence and electronic intercepts that would back up that assumption. I think the proof must be that the Syrian army did not do this, and that somehow one must explain how it therefore happened. Now, if you could make an argument about a terrible accident at a depot that blew up accidentally, that would work. There's no evidence of that. We're talking about an attack of size and sophistication and a real attack with real weapons. That, I would argue, makes it different from what happened in Iraq in 2002, 2003. It's a different debate. That doesn't mean the policy discussion shouldn't be carried on, but we're looking at real hard evidence here.
I think that the question speaks to the impact that the Iraq war had on all of our psyches, particularly when it comes to questions about the use of force. I want to move on to some other questions. I've ignored the side of the room. I'm coming back to you. Was there one here, sir?
Thank you. Dr. Hoyt, I had the pleasure of meeting you and hearing you lecture when I was a student at the War College. Question for both you gentlemen, if I may. The talks in Washington right now about a possible attack of any kind are going to be limited in scope, limited in scale, limited in cost. If our desired end state is anything other than regime change, more than likely Bashar Assad will survive any kind of attack that we implement,
Yes.
whether we're behind in any way. Your opinion on whether or not that will further embolden him, which I believe it will, to who? Who is his center of gravity? His center of gravity has got to be not his weapons stocks or his sarin gas or his involvement, his support from the Russian nation or from China or from anyone else. His center of gravity is the fear and loathing this administration and the rest of our international partners have of who might replace him should these strikes be successful. One other comment, if I may. Sir, you brought up you brought up the statement about why the military is being more powerful now, why they have reversed their successes, and the Syrian army now is more successful. You have non-state actors, and you have state actors such as Iran and Russia that have been over the last 18 months flying in air supply and emboldening and further resupplying the Syrian forces. It's that belief in the last 18 months that's reversed the successes of the Syrian army. Your comments, please, gentlemen.
Could you recap that question? I think the microphone was a little bit soft.
Certainly, I'll do my best. The first question is, what is the center of gravity for the Assad regime? What is the most important element, the thing which, at least in theory, if one could find a way to affect, would fundamentally change the situation and perhaps achieve American aims? The second part of the question was, has the import of arms and support from Iran and Syria been fundamental in helping reverse the military situation on the ground so that the Syrian government forces are now doing much better? In response to the second question, I would say yes. Right? I think the involvement of Russian resupply has been important. The involvement of Iranian forces and Hezbollah has been important in bolstering the regime. I think that's also aided, however, by the fact that we talk about a Syrian opposition. This is not a united, trained military force. This is a bunch of different groups led by a bunch of different guys in a bunch of different places. It's not particularly coordinated. It's not particularly militarily effective. And as a result, it doesn't have the military force to take the state. So you have a seesaw battle going on. In some areas, the government's doing well. In other areas, the government's doing poorly. where the government has done well recently, certainly it had help from Hezbollah, which was very important in recent battles over the summer. In terms of the center of gravity, I guess another way to look at this is, again, to look at what is it that we want to accomplish. If what we want to do is throw down a marker about chemical weapons, right, what we want to do is create in the minds of the Syrian government doubt and fear that if they use these things again, bad things will happen. One might think about then, again, targeting the units that fire chemical weapons, the units that were responsible for the attack, or for finding other military assets that Assad values that you can kill. One of the ongoing arguments in Washington is attacking the Syrian Air Force. I don't know how decisive that will be. I don't know how effective the Syrian Air Force is, but it's a way of putting pressure on Assad without attacking Assad personally, to say to him, we will hurt you for doing this. If you do it again, we may hurt you worse. That sounds very clear, simple, and easy, and as we know, war is not that way. But that might be a way of using limited military force to try and achieve a very limited objective of making sure that Assad thinks twice before chemical weapons are used again in Syria.
For both Clark and Tim, what about war crimes prosecutions for officers involved in the use of chemical weapons?
Well, frankly, I'm all in favor of it. And for those of you who didn't read my crazy rant in the National Interest on Friday, I think it's up on the Pell Center Facebook page. One of the arguments I made was that we really need to bound this problem, otherwise we may get in a problem of escalation, it may get out of our control. My recommendation was that you attack the 4th Armored Division very heavily, which is the unit that's responsible for these chemical attacks. And also, in addition, that you mark all of the officers in the unit for war crimes prosecution. And that further, you use other tools that we have now, like social media, put their names and faces up in front of the world, and then further to affect them personally and to make a mark so that Syrian commanders in the future will not use chemical weapons. Go after their international bank accounts using law enforcement proceedings. If they have children who are studying abroad, revoke their visas and send them home. Find ways to raise the cost for the people who actually use the weapons and convince them that no more than in 1945 can you just obey orders anymore. If you use chemical weapons, you will be in violation of international law and you will be treated as a war criminal, and it will affect you personally and affect your family. That's not nice. Don't get me wrong here. Right? I'm not trying to be nice. If this is what we really want to do, deterrence happens at a bunch of different levels. We may not be able to change Assad's mind, but we may be able to change the mind of the lieutenant colonel who commands the artillery battery, who gets the order to fire chemical weapons into a suburb again. That might be worth trying. I can't promise it works, but that was my argument.
I would just say amen to all that. Brand Assad an international war criminal, threaten him with prosecution. All of his hardcore military supporters, absolutely brand them as war criminals. Those who are not necessarily hardcore regime supporters, those who might abandon Assad if things looked shaky, those I would not publicly brand as war criminals, but you want to make them worry that they might be branded as war criminals, as an incentive for them to switch sides if the time comes.
I'll probably ask you a question you probably can't answer, but given that we can agree that chemical weapons were used, what possible advantage is there to Assad, besides really irritating the rest of the world, militarily or strategically? He's going to be killing civilians, children, and that's going to annoy everybody else who's in the rest of the world. So what was going on, do you think, in his mind when he did this? What is the possible purpose of it all?
I have to speak extremely hypothetically here because I just don't know, right? I think we literally do not know enough. It will be interesting to find out if we ever discover anything approaching the truth. There are a number of different possibilities of what happened. One is that Assad gave the order. Militarily, perhaps one could argue that this was done to drive rebel forces back from the suburbs of Damascus. There may have been some sort of military logic to it. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily make sense to me, but what disturbs me is it's out of the pattern. If he's used chemical weapons in the past, it's been in very small doses, very concentrated areas, for very, very limited purposes. All of a sudden, there's this big attack. So some have argued that this is his way of poking his finger in the eye of the international community. I don't know why he would want to do that. I mean, I really don't, but I guess it's possible. Maybe he's calling America's bluff. Maybe he's getting more desperate than we thought he was. I think another possibility, though, that we probably can't rule out is the possibility that a local commander overstepped rules of engagement. And the reason I raise that, again, I don't know, just from what we've read in the papers, there was apparently a very panicky call from the Syrian Ministry of Defense to the army immediately after the attack occurred. So it's possible that these weapons have been distributed, that they've been fired under very careful orders in the past, and that for some reason this time a military commander took it upon himself to fire a lot more of them, but we just don't know. Again, that makes assigning blame at some level difficult, assigning personal blame. But at the same time, there is certainly a government responsibility because the weapons were available, they were used. Therefore, at least at some level, Assad and the regime bear responsibility for the act.
Next question. Wanted to know if you could discuss a little bit of the relationship between Iran and Syria. And I mean, I know Iran is all Shiite, and Syria is about 75% Sunni, if I'm not mistaken, but the all-white is Assad. And the other question that comes up to me, the reason they can get the weapons back and forth is because the largest open border is between Syria and Iran. And I don't, why is Iran backing Syria so much? That's the question.
Syria has acted for many years now as a conduit between the Iranian regime and Hezbollah in Lebanon. That's a serious threat to Israel, obviously. It's also a threat to America's larger interests in the region. A solidified crescent of power, Shia power centered in Iran, anchored in Iran, but spreading through Shia-dominated Iraq now, including Syria, and then anchored at the other end by a very well-organized, very savvy Hezbollah. That is a scary prospect for the United States and for many of our friends. That is a picture that we would like to not see come clearer.
I think in addition, there's a historical element here. Once there was one Ba'ath Party which believed in basically unifying the entire Arab world. That was in the 1940s. In the 1950s, you saw the emergence of competing Ba'ath parties in Iraq and in Syria. As a result, in the Iran-Iraq War, by 1982, Syria and Iraq were hostile enough to one another that Syria cut off Iraqi oil supplies on a pipeline that ran across Syrian territory, and Syria committed to be on Iran's side. So some of this has to do more with a historical relationship between Syria and Iran that dates back 30 years. Assad has relied on that alliance because it's useful for him. And the shipment of gear and equipment and support has been made somewhat easier across Iraq because Iraq at this point is much less centrally controlled. There's a lot more opportunity to smuggle things across Iraqi territory. after the deposal of Saddam than there was earlier. So it's both opportunity and tradition that links these together. The Syrian-Iranian alliance has been around for a long time. It's not something new.
We've got another question in the back here.
I understand that Senator Kerry made a statement that some of the physical evidence about chemical use was through Doctors Without Borders. Doctors Without Borders subsequently gave an official statement, said that that evidence was not hard and fast, that it was second or third hand. So wouldn't our credibility be supported if we relied, say, on the UN team that was in there investigating, even though some people say, well, it's too late, the gas has disappeared, or they won't be able to assess that, but wouldn't we be on surer ground if we at least waited for the UN statement?
Yes. I'm a great believer that in situations like this, you should accumulate as much evidence as you can and try and understand what actually happened. There are doctors' groups that were putting out reports of treating victims where the symptoms were identical to sarin gas exposure as early as, I think, August 22nd in newspapers. I mean, the story broke through the press, at least in part, because of reports from medical teams that were on the scene. Whether they were Doctors Without Borders or not, I'm afraid I don't know. Unfortunately, the UN team went home early. I think it was last Thursday or Friday. And the reason was that they were afraid that an American military strike was imminent. So as a result, they left the region because they were afraid that they were going to be in the target area. That's unfortunate. I think it's interesting that Russia asked for a UN investigation of the chemical sites to try and help figure out what the explanation was. And apparently the Iranian president or prime minister has tweeted that chemical weapons use is bad and that they should investigate it and find out who was responsible, which is very interesting. Now, admittedly, Twitter, who knows who put it up, but it's very interesting that this is apparently from a site that's associated with the real new Iranian elected leader, so that might be very interesting in its own right.
One other comment on Doctors Without Borders. You can imagine that organization was embarrassed by Secretary Kerry's announcement, connecting them with information identifying the use of nerve gas by Syria. Doctors Without, I can certainly understand that Doctors Without Borders would want to distance themselves from that because they need to go into troubled areas to do their work, and they don't want to be identified as a party that could take sides in a conflict. That could endanger their work in other places where they are.
Yes. First, let me, I think, for speaking for everyone, thank Salve for hosting this very urgent, poignant, and complex forum. So I think we all very much appreciate that. My very specific question is on the military topic. I don't think that 60 or 90 days of Exocet missiles would be a pinprick, first of all. But aside from that, there's a great deal of discussion about giving the Free Syrian Army or vetted individuals in that constellation anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons from Qatar, from Libya, from wherever, so that the balance of play, that we could get to a tipping point. Admittedly, this raises so many other questions, who would replace them and so forth. Yeah. But just on that narrow question, thinking of Libya somehow a model where air power, NATO and American air power, pushed things in a very different direction, and then on the ground folks with anti-air and anti-armor missiles really could change the equation. What would you think about that type of proposal or scenario?
Well, the first big problem with that is Libya was a very permissive air environment. Libya did not have sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. The ones that had accumulated in the 1970s and 1980s had degraded to the point of almost uselessness. To provide the kind of air support in Syria that would enable the resistance fighters to get a great deal of military traction would require a massive operation, much bigger than a pinprick, much bigger than cruise missiles. It would require suppression and elimination of enemy air defenses. It would require probably destruction of the Syrian Air Force. It would be a big, robust operation.
You missed the question. I'm talking about the Free Syrian Army creating, not the U.S. at all, but the Free Syrian Army creating a no-fly zone from the ground up, rather than from the air down.
Could the Free Syrian Army create a no-fly zone from the ground up?
I don't think so. Not without, truly massive supplies of surface-to-air missiles, larger than anything that we gave to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. It would be a massive transfer of weapons, and those would be weapons, given the makeup of the Free Syrian Army, that Western states would be very worried about what happened to the leftovers. Because unfortunately, elements of the Syrian opposition are al-Qaeda linked and are linked with other radical groups, and the aftermath of that conflict might then find dozens, hundreds, thousands of portable surface-to-air missiles in the hands of people who might use them for very different reasons against very different targets like airliners. So I think that there's a real reluctance on the part of the United States to support that kind of activity. I think that Qatar and Saudi Arabia have already been involved in training and providing arms for various opposition factions. To me, the military problem of turning the fortunes of the opposition around would require more than just giving them more advanced portable weapons. It would require, I think, much more significant air intervention by an outside power.
If I could also say something. This is on the order of conjecture. I'm almost thinking out loud here. But let's think about best case. What would be the best outcome that we could hope for and possibly bring about? Well, it would be to remove the Assad regime and also control who comes to power to replace them. Hopefully moderate Sunni elements. How could we do that? Well, we can't do that directly. We can't do that with standoff missile strikes. We're certainly not going to put American troops on the ground to help bring that about. So how could we possibly remove Assad and control which faction of the insurgents comes to power? We would need to identify the moderate faction. We'd need to know who they are. And we'd probably need help identifying them and making sure we had the right people. Perhaps the Turks could help there. That's the very conjectural part. Once we've done that, we need to supply those factions with materiel, with weapons, perhaps with air power, technical support, military advisors. And again, it's not going to be Americans. We are not going to send Americans on those missions. They would need to be possibly Turks. I'm not sure how the Syrians would, but maybe under these circumstances, the Syrians would be okay with some Turks coming in to help oversee. And also the Turks on the ground in Syria would need to make sure that all of this advice and weaponry was actually getting into the hands of the people that we can trust, moderate Sunni elements, okay, not the extremists. At the same time, we would also have to bargain with Russia so that everything that we put in is not matched by what they put in.
So we're at the point where normally we would end this kind of conversation because we didn't feed you, and it's dinner time. But there's, I know, at least two more questions in the back, and I think a couple up front. So we're gonna keep soldiering on here. Ma'am, you have the microphone. Go right ahead.
Well, thank you for coming and thank you for staying. My question is about the paradigm of deterrence. It seems to me that, okay. My question is about the paradigm of deterrence, that if we're always deterring the use of chemical weapons from rogue groups, because any government is going to deny their mistakes. Therefore, it's always a rogue group, and why would how can you deter rogue groups, which are just that? That's one question. And the other one is, what is Russia's response?
Well, in terms of deterring rogue groups, deterrence is a phenomenon that works probably differently against non-state actors than against states, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. Deterrence is a function of, and boy, I'm sorry this sounds so clinical because we're really talking about ugly, nasty stuff, right? But it's a question of putting enough fear and doubt in your enemy's mind that they don't do something that you don't want them to. Against states, you can do that by building up really large militaries, right? You get arms races and a whole bunch of other effects. In the case of rogue groups, you probably have to figure out a great deal about what that group actually wants to achieve and what it values. You have to find ways to hold that at risk. It's not impossible. It's just more difficult. It may be the kind of thing that you can't carry out with a conventional military. It may be the kind of thing that you have to threaten, for instance, Al-Qaeda. They probably are deterred from certain types of activity because they now know that if you're not very careful, a whole lot of SEALs can come down on your compound and kill you. That has a deterrent effect. Again, these are not nice things we're talking about, but it may be necessary with rogue groups to get down to that personal level, to threaten individuals, to threaten families, to threaten tribes or groups. That may be the mechanism you need if you want to have a deterrent effect. What Russia is going to do, I think Russia is sitting back and watching. I think they would veto a UN action. I'd be surprised if they didn't, let me put it slightly differently. I think they will be careful about the weapons that they supply to the Syrian regime. But unless they see a fundamental change in the situation, they will not be constrained from continuing to supply weapons to the Syrian regime as long as the Syrian regime pays cash, which is what it's been doing. So I would be very surprised to see them make a major intervention. I think right now, the main thing they'll try and do is stop a massive US intervention, which, again, looking at the debates, doesn't appear to be in the cards right now anyway.
We've got a question down here.
Yeah. Quick question. When we're looking at the statements that came out from the Arab League over the weekend, and Saudis relatively trying to play the line of being relatively neutral and some support towards the U.S., is there any hope of getting any support on the Arabian Peninsula, either publicly or covertly, for whatever we're doing in Syria?
That's a great question. Did everybody hear that? No. Okay. Nope, just figured I'd check. The question was, is there any hope of getting support from the Gulf states for either overtly or covertly for whatever action the United States decides to take? Certainly covertly. And in fact, I think there are lots of press reporting out now already about aid, especially again from Qatar and from Saudi Arabia, aiding factions in the opposition in Syria. That would continue to happen. I can see options where that would involve more direct cooperation. Overtly, I think probably less likely. Again, the Arab League and Arab states in general tend not to support massive interventions against other Arab regimes. I mean, that's been the history. Not so much in the case of Desert Shield and Desert Storm, but that was an unusual circumstance. Otherwise, in general, the idea, they support the norms of sovereignty because sovereignty is important for other regimes in the Arab world. So I would think overt support is less likely.
No.
Excuse me. Am I on? Can you? Yes, I am. To follow up the last question about Russia and the UN, a couple questions. Why didn't the U.S. or an ally ask for a resolution from the Security Council at the UN or submit a resolution automatically in a case like this when the chemical weapons have been used, asking the members to support a resolution worded appropriately, maybe not military action per se, but action would be taken to show that they did not condone this action and that they would take some action or do something to show that they did not want it to happen again. Why didn't they do that? Instead, we hear on the news right away something like, it is not likely that Russia or China would support it, and so, no Security Council action. Why didn't something happen? Why wasn't a resolution submitted anyway around the Geneva Convention Protocol? So we have something for the record. Why wouldn't we want to have something from Russia and China for the record? We might be surprised. I'd be interesting, the discussion there from Russia, because don't you think Russia's input could be very helpful and important at this time?
So if I'm not mistaken, the P5 met last week. The British tabled a proposal, and the permanent members couldn't come to consensus on it. Is that, I didn't make that up, right?
I don't think so, but to be honest, I don't know.
Yeah, I think actually that the British actually, before their parliament voted, the British actually circulated a proposal at the United Nations Security Council last week. And I'll be honest with you, that my recollection's a little bit hazy. I don't think I'm making this up, but that it was discussed among the P5 and they could not get consensus, and that was the end of it. I think that the Security Council works in a way where there's sort of known, red lines that the members are not going to cross, and they don't waste a lot of time once that consensus is clear. We've got time for one more question, and then we're gonna let you go. So here's Francesca, who runs the cyber program at the Pell Center.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for being here. So I'll try to be brief. I was wondering if you could comment on some of the consequences of a U.S. attack in Syria, and specifically because, like Jim says, I work on cybersecurity. This would be the first time, if the United States attack, that it actually strikes a country fully capable of waging retaliatory cyber attack. Like we've already seen minimal with the U.S. defacement of the U.S. Marines website and the New York Times hack and Twitter. So what were your comments on that?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the problem with making a military strike in these circumstances is that the consequences are actually pretty unpredictable. Just so you all know where I stand, I'm not sure we should make a military strike. The arguments that I'm making, however, are if we are going to make one, which appears to be what we are thinking about, how do we do it most effectively in ways that limit the consequences? I believe if you target the Assad regime, you do the equivalent of putting them on what the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu called death ground. And when you're on death ground, you fight really, really hard, right? So if we target the Assad regime as part of these strikes, we may create, again, incentives for chemical weapons use, incentives for even greater mass slaughter than has already been carried out, because the regime then has nothing to lose. It wants to win quickly, change the facts on the ground before the U.S. can respond. I think attacks against electricity nodes, against command and control, I mean, these are things that popped up in the Washington, D.C. sort of debate inside the Beltway through op-eds and magazine and journal articles in the last couple of weeks. Those are things that worry me, because we found in the case of Iraq that if you attack those kinds of nodes, it is even harder for a repressive regime to maintain control over its military forces. And again, then, things may spin more out of control rather than less. So to me, if you're going to use military force, my argument would be find specific targets that you can say, unambiguously are linked to whatever it is that you want to prove. Hit them, back off, and wait and see what happens, and hopefully Assad will not escalate. I think that's a very dangerous game to play, but that is also the game that you play with military strikes and with war, unfortunately. The case of cyber retaliation, I don't know what that response would look like. I don't know what Syria's capabilities are.
With the help of Iran, which is probably ready to give back.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, again, and the question would then become, does Iran want to get involved? Now, there are certain things that we could do that I have no doubt would create an incentive for an Iranian response. I mean, if our attack was big enough, if we tried to put troops on the ground, I mean, there's a whole range of things that theoretically we could do that might lead to that kind of escalation. If the attack is much more limited, Iran might want to keep its hand hidden because they have things to worry about as well. If they get involved in something more overt with the United States, given the problems we've had with the Iranian regime the last couple of years, given the nuclear issue and discussions that have been going on for several years about the possibility of preemptive strikes, I would think Iran would want to play this very carefully. I may be wrong. The new leader appears to be putting a very different face in front of the world, which I think we should all view as sort of a positive sign. So again, if it's Syria that responds with cyber capabilities, I'm not sure that those are overwhelming. If they had been, I would think they'd have been used against Israel already, right? That we would have seen much more of that happening nearby because it's easier to do. That said, if others get involved, if Iran gets involved, if China or Russia get involved, well, certainly China and Russia have much more formidable capabilities for interfering. And Iran has demonstrated some capabilities as well. I think the other option for escalation that we might not want to forget, again, because of links with Hezbollah, because of links with Iran, if the United States gets too involved, the way in which escalation occurs may be terrorist acts elsewhere. Terrorist acts in Latin America. Unfortunately, we've seen Hezbollah active there. We've seen Iranian Revolutionary Guards active in places like Thailand and New Delhi. So there is some possibility that that would be an escalatory response. If it were relatively small, that might be a tit for tat and then it ends. But it's possible that that also could spiral out of control depending on the circumstances. And that's, again, one reason that we need to keep discussing what the consequences are of a military strike.
Folks, this has been a tremendous conversation. And before we go, if we had thought about this, we would have had clickers, and we would have done this all up on the screen. But we didn't think about it in advance. So I'm going to ask two questions. And just by a show of hands, we promise not to take any pictures. Do you believe that the United States will attack Syria? Two questions. Do you believe the United States will attack Syria? Raise your hand. Okay. Second question. Do you believe the United States should attack Syria? Raise your hand. Yeah, so the folks down front, it's a night and day picture that you missed. Fascinating. Folks, I want to thank you all for being here. Please thank Tim Hoyt, Clark Merrill for giving us such a great conversation. We are just getting started with our event series at the Pell Center. The program that you got coming to the door has a whole rundown, including a cybersecurity awareness program during the day next week. Hope we'll see you there, and hope we'll see you throughout the semester. Thank you.